Good evening. The Forbidden Dispensary here. Tonight we open with something that looks almost disarmingly plain. A smooth, unremarkable tablet that once promised quiet in a world that wouldn't shut up. And the long trail that little tablet left through operating rooms, break rooms, and courtrooms over the span of decades. Set aside the cozy image of a harmless sedative or the winking nickname, Mother's Little Helper. Beneath the tidy prescriptions and soothing advertising copy is a record of fallout no one meant to unleash. Because if a friend slid you a pill to take the edge off a brutal night, you might never notice how quickly comfort can harden into dependence or how punishing the road away from that dependence can be. Before you sink too far into the couch, hit like and subscribe if this kind of deep dive is your thing. Drop a comment telling the Forbidden Dispensary where you're tuning in from and what time it is on your clock right now. It's still wild to see people dropping in from every imaginable time zone. Now, kill the overhead lights, let the room go soft, and step into tonight's story with us. In the mid-1950s, inside a quiet wing of Hoffmann La Roche's research center in Nutley, New Jersey, a chemist named Leo Sternbach reached for a dusty bottle most of his colleagues would have let sit untouched. In one of those small, unspectacular gestures that history loves to over-dramatize, he closed a ring in a half-forgotten compound and gave the world something it hadn't been waiting for, yet would soon organize a whole era around. Sternbach, born in Galicia in 1908 and trained in the slow, unforgiving craft of European organic chemistry, had been at Roche for more than 10 years, turning over chemical phrases in the hope that one might rhyme with a new pharmacological idea. He was not chasing a miracle blockbuster. He was filing curiosities, building a private catalogue of oddities and maybes. On a winter day in 1955, structure and luck conspired and produced chlordiazepoxide, a fused benzene and diazepine ring, a fresh core skeleton whose outline and muted reactivity would prove both gentle and quietly insistent. It was a tidy little molecule, a 1,4 benzodiazepine less like a firecracker screaming across the sky and more like a coal that glows patiently, refusing to go out. The first lab encounters with chlordiazepoxide were almost anticlimactic. It was logged with the routine, unromantic efficiency of a mid-century pharma shop, drawn in neat lines, run through standard animal screens, and then filed away until someone in pharmacology leaned in and really listened. Eventually, those pharmacologists did just that. Tests in experimental animals turned up tranquilizing and anticonvulsant effects that were markedly different from the clumsy punch of the barbiturate age. Barbiturates, the heavyweight sedatives and sleep agents of the time, were derivatives of barbituric acid, long, relatively rigid structures with carbonyl and nitrogen atoms laid out so that in overdose they could stoke a slow, suffocating shutdown of the respiratory center. At high doses, they pried open chloride channels directly and had an unforgiving therapeutic index. Benzodiazepines did not behave that way. The chemical twist was subtle but deep. A benzene ring fused to a 7-membered diazepine ring. Substitutions at a few key positions that tuned potency and produced a pharmacologic profile that leaned on the brain's own inhibitory systems instead of seizing control of them outright. Sternbach's notebooks, precise, readable, bordered with pencil scrawl and side comments, quietly charted a small revolution. Chemists in Nutley and in Roche's European labs began to work the new scaffold on purpose. Put a chlorine at the 7 position and potency climbs. Drop a phenyl at the 5 position and the drug's personality shifts. Fuse on a triazole ring and the kinetics speed up. Medicinal chemistry drug discovery's version of selective breeding turned into a gardener's game. Some derivatives were grown for speed. Lipophilic, fast-absorbed compounds that could cross into the brain in minutes and calm someone down for a procedure or an acute crisis. Others were bred for staying power, molecules that faded from the central nervous system slowly and lent themselves to long-term anxiety control and seizure prevention. Triazolo and imidazo fusions, later structural add-ons, gave chemists new knobs to twist. Onset, duration, distribution through the central compartment, These could all be nudged, sometimes dramatically, by a small synthetic flourish. It's worth sitting for a second in the quiet before the storm and noticing how methodical, even conservative, this work looked on paper. These chemists weren't cowboys, they were tuning. They calibrated potency in rodents. They watched EEG tracings in animal models. They fretted about hepatic metabolism and the emergence of active metabolites that might drag half-lives out like long shadows. Safety was not some afterthought scribbled in the margins, it was a major selling point baked into the design. In the labs, there was an unspoken agreement that no one wanted to go back to the grim arithmetic of barbiturate overdoses. Barbiturates could kill with a modest miscalculation, depressing the brainstem so bluntly that only a narrow band of dosing was survivable. The vision for benzodiazepines was a kinder breed. Compounds that collaborated with the brain's own braking system instead of ripping the wheel away. In an era still haunted by the lethality of sedatives, that was a powerful promise. From those early yields of chlordiazepoxide grew a small forest of analogues. Diazepam followed quickly in the notebooks, a close cousin with a slightly different ring substitution pattern that Roche would roll out as Valium in 1963, after chlordiazepoxide had already debuted under the brand Librium in 1960. Within a decade, a whole litany of names, oxazepam, temazepam, clonazepam, nitrazepam, triazolam, flurazepam, lorazepam, was appearing in formularies across continents. Each one was a deliberate, almost surgical revision of Sternbach's original frame. Some companies chased quick-onset agents for insomnia or procedural sedation. Others aimed at long half-life anxiolytics that could, in theory, hold a patient steady over days. Patent law and marketing strategy tugged the chemistry in their own directions too. A minor structural twist might buy 10 more years of market exclusivity or plunge a drug into the crowded world of generics. So the surge of analogues was chemical, clinical, and commercial at the same time. The early lab rituals had a certain workman's poetry. Chemists talked about yields and melting points the way bakers talk about crumb and crust. They stood over flasks at reflux, watched tiny clouds form and vanish in condensers, and collected distillates almost like family keepsakes. Pharmacologists carried small vials down corridors into animal rooms, dosed mice and rats, and recorded behaviors in assays that look quaint now but were then the best stand-ins for human anxiety and sedation. A mouse that trembled less under bright light, or a rat that slept longer under an EEG trace, hinted at something that both doctors and patients might gladly swap for nights of pacing or panic. The structural differences that split benzodiazepines from barbiturates weren't just chemistry trivia, they were mechanistic signposts. Benzodiazepines were modulators. Barbiturates were, in their harsher moments, blunt tools. That contrast carried an instant marketing story, and Roche and its competitors wasted no time leaning into it. With chlordiazepoxide as the proof of concept and diazepam as the star that followed, medicinal chemistry marched into a hungry, competitive marketplace. Labs in Switzerland, the US, Germany, the UK, Japan, and beyond all sent their own takes into clinical testing. And the race was about more than efficacy. Safety became a kind of currency. The early benzodiazepine pitch was that they could deliver the sedative and anticonvulsant benefits of barbiturates without the same brutal risk of fatal overdose. In the shorthand of clinics, they offered a better trade-off between benefit and danger. But the chemists also chased sheer potency. Stronger drugs could be sold in smaller doses, branded as more refined, and courted as the discerning physician's choice. Potency and perceived safety created a pharmaceutical Venn diagram, and market share lived in that overlapping space. Molecules were sculpted to land right there. If the origin story on the bench is one of slow tinkering pulled along by market gravity, the pharmacology that made benzodiazepines feel like wisdom rather than assault is a quieter narrative of molecular negotiation. Benzodiazepines don't yell at the nervous system. They coax. They settle into a specific pocket on the GABA A receptor, a multi-subunit protein that straddles neuronal membranes like a tiny gate and uses the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA to open a chloride channel, letting ions slip in and quench electrical excitement. Picture the receptor as an intricate lock. GABA is the key. Benzodiazepines aren't keys at all. They're the gentle hand that makes the lock more willing to turn. Technically, they're positive allosteric modulators. They raise the odds that when GABA docks, the channel opens, and in doing so, they amplify the brain's own calming signal. This isn't just a metaphor exercise. The GABA A receptor is a pentamer built from multiple subunits, alpha, beta, gamma among them, and the exact combination on a given neuron determines how that cell responds to benzodiazepines. Alpha-1 containing receptors track closely with sedation and sleep. Alpha-2 and Alpha-3 subunits line up more with anxiolysis and muscle relaxation. Alpha-5 gets pulled into discussions of memory and cognition. Drugs that don't discriminate much between these subtypes cast a wide net. Sedation, anxiolysis, anticonvulsant action, and at times cognitive dulling. That subunit selectivity helps explain why one benzodiazepine is perfect for a night of surgical anesthesia, while another is better suited to day-to-day anxiety management, and why later, Z drugs like Zolpidem and Zaleplon in the 1980s tried to focus on alpha-1 rich receptor populations to engineer sleep without the same daytime drag. Pharmacokinetics. The slow math of absorption and clearance mattered just as much as where on the receptor a molecule latched on. A highly lipophilic benzodiazepine sails across the blood-brain barrier quickly and kicks in fast. A less lipophilic one seeps into the CNS more slowly. Diazepam, the old winter-long workhorse, is lipophilic and quick to reach the brain. But it doesn't simply vanish when the subjective effect fades. It redistributes into fat stores and is converted in the liver into active metabolites, like desmethyldiazepam, which themselves bind to GABA A receptors. The net effect is a prolonged action smooth but easily cumulative, especially in older adults or anyone with impaired liver function. Lorazepam and oxazepam, by contrast, are cleared mostly through glucuronidation, a more straightforward conjugation route, and don't produce active metabolites. That gave them instant appeal in geriatric care and in patients with compromised hepatic function. These kinetic fingerprints translated straight into bedside practice. Long half-life benzodiazepines, like diazepam, worked well for generalized anxiety and seizure prevention because their effects stretched across days like a slow coat of paint. Short-acting options, such as triazolam, delivered a tight, fast sedation for insomnia, but tended to provoke rebound symptoms. A night of deep sleep, followed by a morning of sharpened anxiety as the drug washed out. Midazolam, an imidazobenzodiazepine, was shaped for the operating room. Quick in, quick out, intense but brief. A tool meant for the rhythm of the OR, not the living room. The unhurried chemistry of metabolism, the in and out of active and inactive metabolites, shaped prescribing patterns as much as any clinical trial. Mechanism and metabolism together also explain the twin truths that benzodiazepines felt safer than barbiturates in terms of immediate overdose risk, yet came bundled with their own slower dangers. Unlike barbiturates, benzodiazepines usually can't pry the GABA A channel open in the absence of GABA itself. They boost an existing brake instead of hot wiring it. That's why a benzodiazepine taken alone, in overdose, is less likely to shut down breathing as catastrophically as a barbiturate might. But combine benzodiazepines with other depressants, alcohol, opioids, certain sedating antihistamines, and the mix can turn quietly, efficiently lethal. Tolerance creeps in too. The brain slowly recalibrates its inhibitory set point. A regular user finds that the same dose no longer softens the edges the way it once did. The nervous system becomes less responsive to GABAergic persuasion in general. Dependence follows, not as one dramatic cliff, but as a shifted baseline. Take the drug away, and what's left is anxiety, tremor, and in the worst cases, seizures. From the start, the clinical craft was in navigating those tensions, using the drugs for sharp, immediate relief while guarding against the slow slide into long-term habituation. Those biological facts became real in exam rooms. A clinician in a crowded clinic, Manchester, London, New York, Munich, learned quickly that one small tablet that stopped a patient's hands from shaking and allowed even ragged sleep could feel indispensable in a world short on psychiatric beds and patients alike. Pharmacology told doctors some agents were harder to kill yourself with, others safer in the elderly, still others trickier around certain liver enzymes and polypharmacy. The presence of flumazenil, a benzodiazepine site antagonist that could, in controlled settings, reverse sedation, added a psychological safety net for doctors afraid of overshooting. There was a halo effect around these drugs. They worked, and they looked safer. That glow made their path into everyday practice surprisingly short, or at least socially fast. After the standard round of animal work and volunteer trials, chlordiazepoxide was launched as Librium in 1960. Doctors and psychiatrists were handed data from brief clinical studies showing lower anxiety scores, better self-reported sleep, and calmer autonomic signs. These trials, by the standards of their time, were legitimate but small. Weeks, not years. Dozens of patients, not thousands. Outcome measures that mixed hard signs with soft impressions of feeling better. The Hamilton Anxiety Rating Scale had just been introduced in 1959, and clinicians were still learning how to translate old notions of nerves into numeric scores. Regulatory structures were shifting at the same time. The thalidomide disaster in Europe and the Kefauver-Harris amendments in the US in 1962 tightened rules for proof of efficacy and manufacturing quality. But they didn't yet demand that every long-term risk be mapped in slow, expensive, longitudinal studies before a drug flowed into mainstream use. A solid demonstration of short-term benefit and a reassuring acute safety profile were enough to turn on the tap. Drug companies were never just neutral couriers of molecules. They were strategic machines. Hoffmann La Roche poured resources into a wide sales force in the US, Europe, and beyond. Reps walked hospital corridors and clinic hallways with sample cards, glossy brochures, and a soft, insistent pitch. Here is the answer to all that vague modern anxiety. Marketing hammered the contrast with barbiturates gentler, safer, less likely to spark violent withdrawal ideal for the nervous tensions of everyday life. It was a story tuned to the cultural moment. Post-war prosperity in the US and parts of Europe had built new expectations of psychological comfort, and physicians, overloaded and under-resourced, were ready to embrace anything that looked like a neat technological solution. Pop culture picked up the theme and turned it into both joke and mirror. In 1966, the Rolling Stones sang about Mother's Little Helper, sketching a suburban woman with a discreet bottle hidden in the cabinet, and the world chuckled and looked away at the same time. Clinical enthusiasm both fueled and fed on the rising prescription numbers. Early data were clear enough. Chlordiazepoxide lowered anxiety ratings. Diazepam calmed agitated inpatients and helped with alcohol withdrawal. The compounds delivered. What the trials didn't show was what 10 or 20 years of continuous use would do when those pills were scattered across millions of kitchens and nightstands. Long-term dependence barely registered on the regulatory radar in the early 1960s. The urgent problem of barbiturate deaths and brutal withdrawals had dominated clinicians' nightmares. Now, here was something that looked comparatively tame. Doctors saw good short-term results, and because the obvious acute risks, fatal respiratory depression, lethal monodrug overdose, were so much lower, the psychological barrier to liberal prescribing crumbled. General practitioners started writing benzodiazepine scripts the way earlier generations had handed out barbiturate samples, and psychiatrists found them helpful for a wide, often fuzzy range of complaints. The regulatory choreography mattered. After 1962, the US insisted on adequate and well-controlled studies, and Roche and its rivals produced trials that met those checkboxes short RCTs against placebo or barbiturates. often showing equal or better safety. European authorities were sometimes faster to allow use, each filtered through its own medical culture and bureaucracy. In hospitals, fast-acting injectable benzodiazepines for status epilepticus and pre-op sedation quickly became indispensable. In outpatient settings, their capacity to smother anxiety, immediate, visible, gratifying to both prescriber and patient drove adoption. Within a decade, the new class wasn't new at all. It was standard, and Valium, more than any single member of the family, became the emblem. By the late 1960s and deep into the 1970s, diazepam was one of the top-selling prescription drugs on the planet, pouring revenue into Roche and quietly rearranging how everyday medicine worked. Just under that smooth surface of success, the shadow was already there, largely unexamined. The first trials hadn't been built to catch subtle, long-term neural adaptation or the social patterns that appear when a drug weaves itself into home life. The chemistry and pharmacology had handed clinicians a set of tools that were powerful and, for many, liberating. The machinery of samples, sales calls, and promotional literature translated those quiet bench discoveries into daily habits. Doctors, trusting the pre-market data and their own early experiences, prescribed generously. Patients, grateful for relief, asked for renewals. Pharmacies filled them. New formulations and close cousins kept multiplying the choices and the slogans: faster onset, cleaner mornings, fewer interactions. In that early calm, the story reads almost like an elegy to rational progress. An accidental synthesis in a New Jersey lab, a series of deliberate tweaks, a mechanism that fine-tuned the brain's own brakes instead of smashing them, and a profession hungry for something less deadly than barbiturates. Medicinal chemists aimed for safety and punch because science and business both demanded it. Regulators called for enough proof to unlock the market, not enough to forecast half a century. Sales teams and clinicians turned charts and claims into practice. The stream that started as a neat entry in Sternbach's notebook widened within a decade into a broad current running through everyday life. And because molecules, unlike stories, always have physiologic consequences, the later parts of this tale would have to reckon with what happens when those soft, persuasive hands of benzodiazepines meet the messy, drawn-out realities of human dependence. In those first chapters, though, medicine believed it had found a new set of instruments that matched clinical demand and seemed on balance much gentler than the barbiturates they displaced. That promise and the cultural and commercial engines that amplified it explains how one chemist's mid-1950s curiosity became, in just a few years, a global pharmaceutical phenomenon. The mechanistic story kept unfolding in labs and clinics over the following decades, a slow peeling back of layers. Electrophysiology and receptor biochemistry sharpened the metaphors. Binding assays pinned the benzodiazepine site to the interface between alpha and gamma subunits on the GABA A receptor. Genetics and molecular biology made it clear that subunit repertoires mattered deeply. Alpha 1, Alpha 2, Alpha 3, Alpha 5 were not just Greek letters, but functional addresses in the brain. Drugs that favored alpha-1 rich receptors pushed hypnosis and sedation harder than anxiolysis. Those with more punch at alpha-2 and alpha-3 tended to take the edge off worry without knocking people out. This mapping of subtype to clinical effect dangled a new fantasy in front of industry. Build a drug that touches only the circuits of anxiety and leaves memory and learning alone. So decades after Librium and Valium came the so-called Z drugs zolpidem, zaleplon, zopiclone. They weren't benzodiazepines by structure, but they hunted the same receptor territory with a finer brush, showing relative selectivity for alpha-1, containing receptors and advertised as sleep agents with less daytime hangover. On paper and in cultured cells, this tiered selectivity looked clean. In living people, biology stayed messy. Tolerance showed up anyway. Dependence still took root. Odd side effects, parasomnias, sleepwalking, bizarre behaviors, lingering cognitive fog kept cropping up. The receptor is not a static schematic. It's a living piece of hardware. Push it long and hard enough, and it remodels itself. Pharmacokinetics kept driving real-world choices alongside these receptor subtleties. Compounds with active metabolites like diazepam supported a kind of weakly steadiness, but at the cost of accumulation and prolonged impairment. Benzodiazepines cleared mainly through phase 2, glucuronidation like oxazepam and lorazepam offered simpler, more predictable elimination in people with stressed livers or in older adults whose metabolic machinery runs slower. These seemingly small details turned into clinical reflexes. Lorazepam became an emergency room staple for status epilepticus, in part because its pharmacokinetics were predictable. Midazolam took over the operating theatre and procedure suites thanks to its water solubility and brief duration. Clonazepam carved out a niche in seizure disorders for its strength and long action. Each molecule encoded practical decisions inside it: how often to dose, how closely to monitor, what to tell patients to expect. But no kinetic profile, no receptor subtype cleverness could free benzodiazepines from the core paradox that would come to define their modern story. They were almost brilliantly useful in the short term and steadily treacherous in the long term. The very features that made them so attractive: reliable relief, easy tolerability, broad availability, fed the conditions for overuse. Those early clinical trials and regulatory approvals, solid for their era, were never designed to map what would happen when these pills were written into millions of daily routines. That map only emerged later, in years of clinic observation, epidemiologic work, and the mounting testimony of doctors who kept seeing the same themes: dependence, withdrawal syndromes, lingering cognitive after effects, not rare exceptions but familiar patterns in certain kinds of use. If the 1950s and early 1960s were the age of chemical discovery and fast clinical embrace, the decades that followed sketched out a more ambiguous terrain. But every long narrative starts with one thread, and Sternbach's chlordiazepoxide, its elegant fused ring and soft directive to the brain's inhibitory circuitry, was that first strand. The labs had handed medicine something gentler than the barbiturates could ever claim. But tools always reshape the hands that wield them, and here the hands were many. Clinicians tuned to suffering, sales reps tuned to quotas, patients tuned to relief. That convergence explains how chlordiazepoxide and its descendants traveled from flask to pharmacy, from a theoretical scaffold to a household object. And it's why the story of benzodiazepines would never be resolved by a single synthetic trick, one receptor diagram, or one registration trial, but only by decades of practice, profit, backlash, and reflection. In Hoffmann La Roche's world, where the steel benches smelled faintly of ethers and chlorinated solvents, and the winter light in Basel sank slowly through tall windows, a quiet revolution started with a handful of crystals and a chemist who would not give up on them. Leo Sternbach, a Polish-born researcher who passed through Vienna and wartime Europe before anchoring in Roche's American outpost, sifted through compound after compound in the 1950s, until in 1955 he recorded an effect that the world would later file under tranquilization. That first benzodiazepine, chlordiazepoxide, emerged from that repetitive, almost meditative work and was branded Librium in 1960. Its younger cousin diazepam reached pharmacy counters a few years later, in 1963, as Valium. At first, the names were quiet, just shorthand in lab records and small labels. Very quickly, they became instruments in a larger industrial victory lap. Roche was never just a factory, it was a market architect. Basel had long been a nerve center for chemistry and pharmaceuticals, and the company's global reach plants, research centers, distribution chains into the US, UK, continental Europe, Canada, Australia meant a discovery in one lab could be scaled into everyday life at a volume older generations could hardly imagine. Roche poured money into manufacturing lines, into regulatory dossiers, into tightly designed clinical trials that satisfied the post-Kefauver-Harris standards in the United States, proving that its new benzodiazepines could reliably blunt acute anxiety and agitation. Regulators signed off on that basis. Those trials were short weeks instead of months, aimed at measuring symptom relief, not the slow arc of tolerance or dependency. That absence would end up shaping a big piece of what came next. What Roche did with those data is where business and culture braided into each other. The company deployed an army of sales reps, detail men, and, increasingly, women who made the rounds from Manchester to Manhattan, with more than just journal reprints. They brought branded tissues, pens, desk toys, pamphlets, and above all, sample packs. The goal was to detail the doctor go through every feature of the drug relentlessly. General practitioners were the prime targets. By the mid-1960s, the bulk of mental health work in the US and UK had already moved from psychiatric hospitals into primary care. Family doctors saw more nervous, sleepless, exhausted patients than psychiatrists ever did. They were more numerous, more spread out, and easier to sway with a knock on the door and a 10-minute pitch than the academic consultant on a London ward. The pitches were clinically polished. Roche bankrolled conferences and CME events, sponsored sympathetic studies, and made sure they were splashed across journals and symposia. It cultivated thought leaders, respected psychiatrists and professors who were flown out to give talks, whose names appeared on guidelines and review articles that carried the soft force of authority. Sometimes these doctors were paid, sometimes they were rewarded in subtler ways. Sometimes they simply came to believe and repeated the talking points with the cadence of neutral science. Patient-facing leaflets reframed anxiety as a short-term, treatable biochemical disturbance. Promotional materials drove home the idea of a safer profile compared to barbiturates, lower risk of fatal overdose, smoother dose adjustments, fewer terrifying withdrawal scenes in the immediate term. That message felt like good news in a world still jittery about older sedatives. It traveled quickly. Roche's logistics were sharp. Tablets rolled off lines and into blister packs at scale. Distribution networks made sure that when a new family practice opened in a Connecticut suburb, or a walk-in clinic set up shop in Birmingham, there were sample boxes of Valium waiting in a desk drawer. Pharmacies learned to keep shelves stocked. Repeat prescribing became normalized by both culture and system design. A patient whose insomnia had eased with a few pills called for more. Refills were signed without fuss because it saved everyone time. Doctors spared themselves long conversations. Patients felt taken seriously. Pharmacies rang up steady sales. Roche moved tablets by the ton. In just a few years, Valium shifted from being a niche psychiatric tool to a centerpiece of outpatient medicine, becoming, in the process, one of the first true blockbuster psychotropics. Blockbuster sounds coarse, but it fits. By the late 1960s, Valium was among the most commonly written prescriptions in the United States. Contemporary reports talk about Valium mania, and private letters from clinicians show a mix of satisfaction and unease as the number of scripts climbed. The reasons were straightforward and carefully engineered. A drug that seemed to work for a broad grab bag of complaints, a reputation compared with barbiturates for safety, and a sales machine that had learned how to speak the language of everyday medicine. The company's internal incentives, sales targets, promotions for high-performing reps, profits that tracked directly with mass prescribing, lined up neatly with a health system that rewarded fast, simple interventions. Busy doctors, ubiquitous reps, pills that offered neat solutions. So chronic prescribing wasn't a single villain's scheme. It was the logical product of stacked incentives, corporate, clinical, social, that stretched use far beyond the acute panic attacks and short-term anxieties on which the early trials had focused. Benzodiazepines were gently rebranded in doctors' minds as maintenance therapies, lifestyle balancers, small instruments of everyday civility. They were written for insomnia and tense muscles, for vague pre-surgery jitters, for the somatic complaints of patients who walked into clinics after ugly weeks at work or home. The science had not caught up with the sheer scale of that expansion. Long-term harms tolerance, syndromes of withdrawal, cognitive haze weren't the central concern of the original evidence base, and that silence let the prescriptions roll on. If Roche engineered a medical market, society supplied the demand. The late 1960s were full of contradictions. Sexual revolutions and civil rights marches on one hand, and on the other, the everyday stresses of family life, childcare, domestic work, stuck marriages, all pressing especially hard on women. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963 named a kind of hollow malaise that suburbia produced in many housewives. Benzodiazepines became, in some homes, a chemical hush. The Rolling Stones nailed that domestic shift in a single bitter image: mother's little helper, a housewife popping a pill to get through another day of chores and obligations. The drug as lubricant for a social machine. The phrase entered the common vocabulary and never left. Media didn't just reflect this, it taught it. Women's magazines ran advice columns about nerves and overwhelm, usually ending with a reassurance that modern medicine had gentle answers. Doctors sat on TV panels and repeated that tranquilizers, when used as directed, were safe and helpful. The New York Times, Time, and similar outlets profiled the arrival of a smoother, supposedly more manageable domestic life. In Britain, the figure of the tranquilized housewife, with small orange or blue tablets tucked in a bedside drawer, became a target for both satire and critique. Underneath was a deeply gendered reality. Data from the time and later historical work show that benzodiazepines were prescribed disproportionately to women, especially middle-aged, middle-class women who fit that suburban mold. Several forces fed that skew. Most senior clinicians were men. Their assumptions were steeped in the culture. Women were expected to be more emotionally expressive, more likely to bring psychological distress in the form of physical complaints, more receptive to gentle pharmacologic help than to long-searching psychotherapy. Pressed for time, working inside those assumptions, many GPs found it simpler to offer a sedative than to set up a psychiatric referral or sit in a difficult, long conversation. For patients, the pill offered privacy. It was a discreet fix compared to therapy in a small town, where everyone might know who was seeing the psychiatrist. Marketing made full use of these dynamics. Roche and others bought space in women's pages and underwrote health content that reinforced a neat story. Feminine nervousness, pharmacologic solution. Journals framed benzodiazepines as safe enough to use routinely, effective across a wide range of anxiety-tinged complaints. Those claims filtered into what the public believed. A woman who walked in with chronic headaches, fatigue, or insomnia might be clinically reframed as anxious and handed a script. The mechanism of repeat prescriptions, the quiet bureaucratic trick that let a patient call the pharmacy and get more without another full appointment, turned single episodes of relief into sustained consumption with almost no theatrical moment of review. The results at home were mixed. For some women, the pills were a genuine pressure valve. For others, they just papered over deeper dissatisfaction. Feminist groups through the 1970s, the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, authors of Our Bodies, Ourselves, and many others, argued that tranquilizers were often chemical band-aids slapped over structural problems. Unequal domestic labor, limited opportunities, bad marriages, scarce mental health care. They didn't denounce pharmacology outright, but they did call out the power structures that made the drug the first tool out of the drawer instead of the last. That critique landed. Slowly, the public tone shifted from celebration toward caution. Historians and sociologists later reached for the word medicalization to describe the expansion of medicine into corners of everyday life, and benzodiazepines became a textbook example. Across the 1960s and 1970s, anxiety was tightened into a more formal clinical concept. Psychiatric nosology, the profession's diagnostic language, evolved. DSM-2 in 1968 still leaned on older terms like neurosis, but the drift was clear. Distress could be segmented into categories, and categories suggested treatments. In time-starved primary care, that path complaint, diagnosis code, prescription became a practical shorthand. Pharmaceuticalization, the commercial cousin of medicalization, names the process by which industry turns people into medicine consumers by broadening disease labels, funding research that favors drug solutions, and supporting education that steers clinicians toward prescriptions. Roche did exactly that, sponsoring studies that foregrounded symptom relief, underwriting guidelines and CME sessions that stressed a benign side effect profile, and promoting the logic that chronic low-dose treatment was perfectly reasonable. The logic is simple. If you can measure a condition, you can market to it. Anxiety, once quantified by rating scales, became easier to sell against. Primary care's architecture made things worse. Appointments were short. Talk therapy was scarce and expensive compared to cheap pills. Psychiatrists were overbooked. Payment systems, especially in the US but also in parts of Europe, favored quick pharmacologic decisions over slower psychosocial care. Repeat scripts kept clinics efficient. Practice finances and administrative pressures all leaned in the same direction. Write another refill. The anchor for this liberal prescribing was the comparison with barbiturates. Barbiturates had a reputation nailed to overdose deaths and savage withdrawal. Benzodiazepines, on the evidence of the 1960s, seemed far gentler. That belief was critical. It allowed incremental expansion into insomnia, situational anxiety, preoperative jitters domains, where a few tablets felt medically trivial and unconnected to abuse. But tolerance builds, dependence sneaks up. For many, the sedative that started as a rescue became part of the evening ritual, then a monthly cycle, then quietly, a medical problem of its own. The formal literature did not ignore this completely. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, case reports and small series described withdrawal, rebound anxiety, rebound insomnia, tremor, and in severe cases seizures when drugs were stopped abruptly. In Britain and elsewhere, a growing number of clinicians and researchers pieced together evidence that long-term benzodiazepine use carried real risks. Malcolm Lader in London, among other psychopharmacologists, produced early work on tolerance and dependence that raised alarms. Regulators and professional societies began to shift their tone, advising short courses and regular review. But what is written in guidance has to survive the frictions of the exam room. Real life is messy. Lonely parents, overworked clerks, veterans back from Vietnam, older people staring down long, wakeful nights medicine kept handing out relief. Corporate supply chains, clinical convenience, and cultural taste formed a loop that normalized tranquilizer use. The industry found its mass market not only among the clearly ill, but among people who simply wanted to be less irritable, more restful, better able to function. Marketing found a public that increasingly prized smoothness and productivity. By the mid-1970s, a thin line of skepticism began to show up in newspapers and magazines. Reporters wrote about pill dependence. They interviewed people who tried to stop and found the nights stretching impossibly long. The story escaped the hospital and entered living rooms. Even as criticism grew, clinical habits held. GPs who had put patients on the same benzodiazepine for years now faced lists of people effectively dependent on their decisions. Some chose slow tapers and support. Others chose uneasy stability, leave the dose alone and avoid rocking the boat. The calculus patients terrified of relapse, doctors overloaded, pharmacists used to routine often favored quiet continuation over disruptive change. In the background, Roche and its peers continued to profit from that steady demand. From a business standpoint, the logic of scale was simple. Chronic users are reliable customers. From a cultural standpoint, tranquilizers remained ambivalent symbols, comic props in films and novels, shorthand for a constrained emotional life that needed pharmaceutical help. The Rolling Stones' sneer had always been edged with sadness. The smile in that song came with a cost that never showed up on a Hamilton score. Feminist activists amplified that point, insisting that medicine too often treated the symptoms of structural problems with pills. Their campaigns helped shift the narrative. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, prescribing patterns began to bend. Research turned toward tapering and withdrawal. Regulatory warnings piled up, but by then the story had long outgrown any single drug or company. The template Roche had helped establish aggressively targeting primary care, recruiting key opinion leaders, shaping public stories about mood and medicine, became the playbook for psychopharmaceutical marketing in general. It's worth pausing to picture the scale and the intimacy at once. A GP's waiting room with dog-eared magazines, the faint disinfectant smell, a parent turning a prescription over in their hand, a sales rep snapping a briefcase closed after a day of pitches, a tablet press somewhere stamping out scored discs with a corporate logo, a turntable in a half-lit living room spinning a record that jokes about this exact quiet transaction as though it were a moral fable. Those grainy details are the bones of historical change, not one big event, but 1,000 small repeating gestures. Benzodiazepines did solve real problems: acute terror, pre-op panic, seizure emergencies. In those settings, they were and still are gifts of chemistry. But the commercial apparatus that multiplied them, the cultural currents that normalized them, and the clinical structures that routinized their use together created a scale of exposure that would later come under sharp review. The creation of a vast consumer market for tranquilizers in the 1960s was both a capitalist success story and a sprawling social experiment. It taught doctors to use drugs as tools of social management. It taught the public that a wide range of distress could be sanded down with a pill. And it unfolded not just in clinics and boardrooms, but along familiar gender lines and in the quiet accommodations of family life. Women, especially in post-war American and British suburbs, became both the prime consumers and the central icons of medicated domestic peace. The pill fit an era desperate to hide toil and keep home life frictionless. That was useful. It was also deeply troubling. Feminist critiques and the mounting evidence on dependence reframed the plot. Medicine slowly reasserted the language of limits. Time-bound courses, regular review, caution. But habits shaped by appointment schedules, prescription pads, pharmacy workflows, and the sheer ease of repeat authorizations are hard to unwind. When historians trace the arc from Sternbach's first crystals to the millions of blister packs shipped worldwide, they can't ignore the market architecture Roche built. The company fused scientific discovery with a sharp feel for the rhythms of frontline medicine. It focused on GPs not because they were the most expert, but because they were the most numerous and accessible. It worked within regulatory rules that weighed short-term efficacy more heavily than long-term safety. It cultivated public acceptance through media and expert voices. The result was something that, by the late 1960s, was no longer just a drug, but a social implement. That's how a tranquilizer becomes a blockbuster. Not through magic, but through free samples, persuasive lectures, glossy print ads, the unspoken consent of overloaded clinicians, and the quiet hope of patients who simply wanted to feel a little less raw when the alarm went off. The story that began in a Basel lab ended up in kitchen drawers and nightstands, in the pause between a ringing phone and a parent's decision. It's a story of markets and medicine braided into everyday life, of a culture that found in a small compressed tablet both relief and a mirror. By the late 20th century, as evidence stretched out over years and new psychotropic classes arrived, the world slowly turned back to look at what had been normalized in the 1960s and 70s. The debates that followed weren't just clinical. They were about politics, labor, family, and responsibility. What belongs to medicine? What belongs to social policy? When does a useful sedative harden into a chronic dependence? How should societies share out the supports that make medication the least necessary, not the default option? Those are questions no single company can answer, even though many have tried to position their pills as answers. The history of benzodiazepines is less about one big epiphany and more about a drawn-out negotiation between chemistry, commerce, culture, and care. A negotiation whose echoes still shape how the Forbidden Dispensary and modern medicine at large thinks about sleepless nights, jangling nerves, and the urge to medicate the ordinary pain of being alive. The Forbidden Dispensary wants you to picture how the first cracks showed up, not in headlines, but in the hushed background of ordinary clinics. It started as an echo. Repeat prescriptions sliding through the mailroom, patients insisting they couldn't sleep without their pills. A GP in a suburban English practice, pen hovering over a chart, saying quietly, "She says she only feels like herself when she takes it." That's how the story of tolerance and dependence began to be written, not as some dramatic reveal, but as a ledger of little observations that finally forced science and policy to catch up with lived experience. In the decades right after Sternbach's graceful accident at Roche chlordiazepoxide in the early 1960s, diazepam shortly after benzodiazepines were sold as the kinder successors to barbiturates, a safer harbor from overdose tragedies and from doctors' dread of sedating people right up to the edge of death. The marketing copy spun an intentional tale, non-habit forming, mild, ideal for the worried minds of modern life. Culture sang in tune. The Rolling Stones' Mother's Little Helper in 1966 stamped into public consciousness the image of a small, officially sanctioned tranquilizer parked on the nightstand of housewives and office workers. A little white disc of state-approved calm. It all felt harmless, almost companionable. But medicine, like any craft, is built on repetition. The first controlled studies had been brief. They measured sedation, sleep, immediate anxiolysis. They didn't watch the nervous system slowly rewrite itself around a steady chemical presence. Out in clinics, though, GPs and psychiatrists saw the unspooling. A soft erosion of effect, then a louder insistence. Patients who had taken benzodiazepines for months or years realized that the dose that once helped barely moved the needle anymore. They asked for more and often got it. They showed up earlier for refills. Some became oddly agitated instead of calmer. Others developed paradoxical irritability. Individual quirks accumulated into patterns. Patterns hardened into alarm. By the 1970s and 80s, the tone in the journals shifted. Clinicians like Malcolm Lader in the UK began pooling follow-up data. They drew out two linked phenomena: tolerance, where the pharmacologic effect faded, forcing dose escalation to chase the old level of calm and physical dependence, where stopping, especially stopping fast, produced a predictable, sometimes severe cluster of withdrawal symptoms. In Newcastle, a quiet but relentless pharmacologist and clinician named Heather Ashton did the work that would echo the loudest. By patiently following patients over time, she gave shape to what many had felt but couldn't name. Withdrawal as a real physiological syndrome, sometimes prolonged, requiring care not moral judgment. The withdrawal catalogue that emerged from clinical reports reads like the nervous system's protest log. Rebound anxiety was often first, a wave of fear more intense than anything that had prompted the prescription in the first place, like the ocean suddenly sucking back before a storm surge. Insomnia came roaring back, not as ordinary restlessness, but as a raw, wired wakefulness. Sensory surroundings turned unforgiving, sounds too sharp, light too bright, skin crawled with tingling, muscles jumped, hands trembled. Some described a hollowed-out feeling, a sense that self and world had moved half a step away, depersonalization and derealization in clinical shorthand. Headaches, nausea, distorted vision, tinnitus all showed up. At the severe end, especially with abrupt cessation of high doses of short-acting drugs, seizures became a real, frightening risk. Memory blurred, mood ricocheted. How you stopped mattered. Short-acting compounds like alprazolam could produce a sharp, jagged withdrawal. Long-acting agents like diazepam, with their trailing metabolites and long half-lives, offered a gentler slope, but they also masked the onset of tolerance, making it harder to see until the dependence was fully baked in. Words became battlegrounds. Some physicians insisted that benzodiazepines were not addictive like opiates, framing that term as too moralizing, too tied to street imagery. Others, especially those watching patients lose jobs, relationships, or any sense of agency around the drug, used the word deliberately. Out of that clash came the language we now take for granted, a distinction between physiological dependence, expected neuroadaptation leading to tolerance, and withdrawal and addiction. a pattern of compulsive use despite harm. Industry and some early opinion leaders stuck for a long time to the story of mild, non-habit-forming anxiolytics. Clinicians and patients dealing with violent withdrawals told a different tale. Animal studies in the 70s and 80s, showing downregulation and other changes in GABA systems with chronic benzodiazepine exposure, offered a biological backbone for what had already become vividly obvious at the bedside. The shift from scattered reports to a structured science of withdrawal wasn't driven by one paper, but by a growing pile: observational studies, prospective cohorts, tapering trials. Heather Ashton's work crystallized that into a manual, a roadmap many patients and doctors would cling to. Her core message: go slow. If needed, switch from short-acting drugs to a long-acting benzodiazepine like diazepam. Stabilize, then reduce in small steps over months, not days. Her manual, compiled through the 1990s and later circulated widely online, became an underground standard. It spoke to clinicians and even more powerfully to patients who had been told their suffering was all in their head. It laid out dose equivalents, incremental reductions, and an insistence on individual pacing, support, and patience. It anchored withdrawal not in willpower, but in pharmacology and neuroadaptation. Health systems learned, often by doing harm, what happens when policy outruns physiology. In some practices, doctors, newly spooked by dependence data, told long-term patients to just stop or cut down sharply. The result was predictable: catastrophic relapse, seizures, emergency admissions. It became painfully clear you could clamp down on new prescriptions without magically unwinding old ones. Limiting initiation was one problem. Safely shepherding long-term users off the drugs was another altogether. As tapering science matured, grassroots activism stepped in. Self-help groups and telephone hotlines sprang up in the 80s and 90s, then migrated online as forums and email lists. People compared symptom timelines, homemade taper schedules, survival strategies. They talked about protracted withdrawal symptoms that stretched for months or years, which some clinicians recognized and others doubted, rightly pointing out the methodological challenges in proving causation over that timescale. The argument continues. Regulators, slower and more cautious by nature, gradually updated their stance. In the US, the 1970 Controlled Substances Act slotted benzodiazepines into Schedule 4, officially acknowledging abuse potential, but still treating them as clearly medically useful and relatively low risk compared to harder drugs. Over the 80s and 90s, the FDA required label changes and stronger warnings about dependence and withdrawal. But label language tends to be understated and legalistic. It often trailed behind what clinicians were already suspecting. Courtrooms became another arena where these gaps were argued out. In Britain, the story mixed moral discomfort with professional self-critique. GP lists were packed with long-term benzodiazepine users by the late 70s and 80s. Professional bodies started urging limits short courses only, careful review. Public health campaigns echoed that message. Scandinavian countries, particularly Sweden and Norway, often moved faster and more tightly, building monitoring and prescriber education programs that pushed hard against chronic use, especially in older people. Each country's path carried its own cultural imprint, but across systems, the chorus became familiar. Keep courses short, be cautious with older adults, taper slowly, and never stop abruptly. Lawsuits added their own pressure. In the US, patients and families sued companies, claiming they hadn't been adequately warned about dependence and withdrawal. Companies responded with label tweaks and, sometimes, settlements. Legal negotiations translated into stronger wording. Habit forming morphed into can cause physical dependence and withdrawal. That might sound like semantics, but it landed in exam rooms. A doctor holding a product insert that bluntly mentioned dependence was, at least in theory, more likely to question another routine renewal. Still, the nervous system doesn't read labels. Long-term prescribing patterns persisted, especially among older patients, exactly because tapering is labor-intensive and clinically delicate. Busy clinics rarely had the bandwidth for finely calibrated dose reductions and frequent follow-ups. By the 21st century, benzodiazepines were pulled into a much darker vortex: the opioid crisis. The lethal synergy between these two sedative systems turned a chronic structural benzodiazepine problem into an acute front-page public health emergency. In 2016, the FDA mandated boxed warnings against co-prescribing opioids and benzodiazepines, highlighting the compounded risk of respiratory depression and death. Similar measures followed in other countries. Overnight, what had long been framed primarily as a story about dependence and withdrawal was also framed as an immediate threat to breathing and survival. It was in this shifting landscape, a backdrop of caution, lawsuits, new labels, and co-prescribing scares, that another class stepped into the spotlight and quietly rewrote the script: SSRIs. Starting in the late 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors arrived with an intensity the Forbidden Dispensary can only compare to the hype around penicillin. Fluoxetine Prozac won FDA approval in December 1987 and landed with the promise of easing depression with fewer acute dangers than tricyclics or MAOIs. No major cardiotoxicity and overdose. No routine sedation. No barbiturate-style breathing collapse. Clinically and culturally, SSRIs embodied a different concept of treatment. Where benzodiazepines excelled at immediate symptom control, quelling panic in minutes, knocking someone out after nights of pacing, SSRIs promised longer-term stabilization and relapse prevention for mood and anxiety disorders. Trials through the 1990s stacked up evidence. SSRIs could not only treat acute episodes of depression, panic disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder, but reduce the risk of those conditions roaring back if continued as maintenance. The calculus shifted. A drug that soothed fast but rewired the nervous system in ways that made stopping dangerous was harder to justify for chronic use when there was an alternative that prevented relapse without the same pattern of tolerance and classic withdrawal seizures. That logic pushed psychiatry and primary care guidelines to recommend SSRIs as first-line pharmacologic treatment for many chronic anxiety and mood conditions, reserving benzodiazepines for brief, targeted roles. Real life, of course, was knottier. SSRIs usually take weeks to exert their full effect and can initially worsen anxiety, agitation, or insomnia. Sexual side effects, weight changes, emotional flattening all became part of their own complicated risk profile. Many clinicians bridged those early weeks by adding a benzodiazepine temporarily, giving patients something to blunt the surge while the SSRI kicked in. So benzodiazepines and SSRIs didn't just hand off the baton. They often ran in tandem, co-prescribed as tools for different segments of the same problem. The rise of SSRIs also widened the lens beyond pills. Cognitive behavioral therapy, with roots in the mid-20th century work of Aaron Beck and others, accumulated a strong evidence base for both depression and anxiety. Health systems, at least on paper, began putting money into psychological services. Guidelines, especially in Europe and parts of North America, started insisting that non-drug therapies be part of any long-term plan. In the UK, the later rollout of large-scale, publicly funded psychological therapy programs signaled a commitment, however imperfect in execution, to rebalance away from medication alone. The case for therapy was practical as much as philosophical. Skills learned in CBT or CBTI for insomnia don't vanish when a prescription runs out. They offer relapse prevention that's not glued to a neurochemical crutch. SSRIs brought their own problems. Discontinuation syndromes, dizziness, brain zaps, mood swings surfaced in the 1990s and 2000s, undermining early claims that they were entirely non-habit-forming. Long-term SSRI use sparked debates about emotional blunting and about whether medicine was pathologizing everyday sadness. Public narratives swung wildly: SSRIs as miracle pills, SSRIs as numbing agents. Meanwhile, clinicians trained in this newer era tried to balance fast control of distress with informed consent and a longer view of harms and benefits. For benzodiazepines, the SSRI era was a mixed blessing. New long-term benzodiazepine starts dropped in some groups as clinicians leaned on SSRIs and therapy instead. Guidance on short-term use and careful review grew sharper, but the old epidemic persisted. Cohorts of older adults remained on the same benzodiazepines for years or decades. Many clinicians were more afraid of triggering destabilizing withdrawal in an 80-year-old than of ongoing sedation and full risk. Epidemiologic studies in the 1990s and 2000s showed benzodiazepine use clustering in older age brackets, tangled up with polypharmacy and outcomes like fractures, confusion, and hospital admissions. Changing that pattern demanded more than a new drug class and updated guidelines. It demanded time, services, and systems that could support slow tapers and non-drug alternatives, things most health systems have been chronically short of. Within the profession, the split never aligned neatly with specialty or ideology. Some psychiatrists defended judicious, long-term benzodiazepine use in carefully selected patients without substance use histories, arguing that for some, the risk of uncontrolled anxiety or repeated hospitalization outweighed the risks of dependence. Others pushed hard for benzodiazepines as last-line tools only, citing the grim stories of withdrawal. SSRIs offered leverage. They made it easier to imagine stepping patients down off benzodiazepines, start an SSRI, let it steady the baseline, then inch the benzodiazepine down over months. Psychotherapy, when accessible, could buttress this, teaching coping strategies that would still be there once the tablets were gone. Culturally, the metaphors around benzodiazepines darkened. The pill that once symbolized gentle domestic control morphed into a more ambivalent signer-dependent grandmother who couldn't sleep without her nightly dose, a young adult whose workday was scaffolded by a script. Mother's Little Helper shifted from pop commentary to something closer to a lament. Yet the Forbidden Dispensary has to resist turning this into a simple cautionary morality play. Benzodiazepines brought real, sometimes life-changing relief. For plenty of people, they enabled work, parenting, survival. The core problem lay less in the molecules than in the disconnect between how they were used and the systems around them, systems that weren't built to support careful withdrawal, long-term psychotherapy, or social fixes for structural stress. Looked at from this vantage point, the benzodiazepine story is about much more than tranquilizers. It's about how medical knowledge creeps into practice, how regulations evolve, how legal risk shapes industry behavior, and how patients through testimony, activism, and lawsuits force those systems to change. The advent of SSRIs didn't erase benzodiazepines. It demoted them, narrowed their ideal uses, and opened space for a more durable mix of therapies, drug and non-drug, for anxiety and depression. It also pulled medicine's gaze forward, away from the exam room moment toward the long tail. What happens not just when we start a drug, but when we try to stop it? There's an irony here the Forbidden Dispensary can't ignore. The sleeping drafts that once soothed a restless century ended up waking medicine to a larger ethical burden. Where clinicians had been trained to focus on immediate suffering, the benzodiazepine era forced them to reckon with the nervous system's capacity to adapt, and the cost, in months or years, of reversing that adaptation. Regulators had to confront the limits of labels and schedules. Patients had to learn that withdrawal was not a personal failure, but a physiological process demanding time and support. The story doesn't close neatly. Benzodiazepines are still on shelves, useful, dangerous, comforting, entrapping. Warnings have grown louder. SSRIs and therapies have shifted center stage. Yet every night, in exam rooms and kitchens, the same micro-negotiations play out. A patient weighing fear against function, a clinician weighing speed against long horizons. If you could listen in after dark, through the thin walls of a city where thousands of these conversations unfold, you'd hear the small sounds of this new economy of care. the soft scratch of a pen writing out a taper schedule instead of another indefinite refill. The quiet explanation that sleep might be rough for a while, but that there is a plan. The almost reverent silence of someone who slept unaided for the first time in years. It's not a grand apocalyptic drama, it's slow work. The unglamorous labor of undoing what seemed quick and simple when it began. The benzodiazepine century taught medicine a hard kind of humility about what it means to interfere with the nervous system and about how patient and deliberate we have to be when we dismantle the supports we've built. They met on the body's slow freeway, two different braking systems, each invented for its own kind of mercy, that together could lock the engine and stall the whole machine. Benzodiazepines, gentle in the way they softened fear and tension. Opioids, older and rougher, willing to dim the roar of pain. For years, these two chemical lineages sat in different aisles of pharmacies and hospital formularies. The benzodiazepine story ran back to Leo Sternbach and Roche in the 50s and 60s, chlordiazepoxide and diazepam, slipping quietly into clinics as civilizing tools for frantic patients and frayed families. The opioid story traced from 19th century morphine and heroin through the 20th century medical embrace and distrust, and then into the late century reinvention of oxycodone as a supposedly safe, long-acting solution for chronic pain. Two separate arcs, then slowly they crossed. The convergence wasn't cinematic, it was bureaucratic, economic, habitual. In American primary care offices in the 1980s and 90s, and in pain clinics from Appalachia to Ontario, the prescription pad became the simplest multi-purpose tool for a cluster of interlocked complaints. Pain, the anxiety pain produces, the insomnia it drags behind it, the existential dread chronic suffering breeds. When Purdue Pharma rolled out OxyContin in 1996 with a marketing push that promised long-lasting relief and a low addiction risk, it also normalized the model of open-ended opioid therapy. In the same visits, doctors wrote scripts for opioids and, just as casually, for benzodiazepines. Little white tablets, little blue ones. The atmosphere in the exam room, fluorescent light, full schedule, billing pressures tilted toward speed. Treat the pain, quiet the nights, calm the nerves. Co-prescribing became common not because of a single conspiratorial plan, but because of institutional drift. Drug reps pushing both product lines, template order sets in electronic records, treatment norms built around 15-minute visits. Pharmacologically, the pairing made a kind of cruel sense. Benzodiazepines dulled anxiety and helped sleep. Those are nearly universal fellow travelers of chronic pain. For people already dependent on opioids, benzodiazepines sometimes served as a makeshift patch over withdrawal symptoms, sedating the restlessness and fear between doses. On the street, the pattern repeated. People using heroin or later illicit fentanyl sought out benzodiazepines to smooth the harsh edges, to deepen intoxication, to silence the mind. Sometimes the combination was intentional, sometimes it was baked into pills and powders without the user's knowledge. The pharmacology behind this was brutally straightforward. Both classes depress the central nervous system. Opioids slow the brainstem's drive to breathe. Benzodiazepines turn down neuronal firing by amplifying GABA. Stack the two, and the margin for error shrinks. Respiratory depression, the slide from heavy sleep into shallow, failing breaths, doesn't care whether the pills were prescribed or pressed on a kitchen table. Naloxone can yank opioids off their receptors and restart breathing. It leaves benzodiazepines untouched. A paramedic might revive someone from the opioid dose, only to find them still dangerously sedated from the benzo. Emergency rooms and morgues learned that lesson the hard way. By the 2010s, that dynamic was stamped into data. Across North America and parts of Europe, toxicology from overdose deaths increasingly showed benzodiazepines riding alongside opioids. In many jurisdictions, a quarter to a third of opioid-involved fatalities also featured benzodiazepines, sometimes more, depending on how thoroughly labs tested. As the US overdose crisis rolled through its three rough waves: prescription opioids, then heroin, then illicit fentanyl from the mid-2010s onward, benzodiazepines remained frequent companions. The CDC and state public health agencies flagged benzodiazepines as co-players in a rising share of deaths. Clinicians took notice. In 2016, the FDA required prominent boxed warnings about combining opioids and benzodiazepines, and CDC guidelines urged against concurrent prescribing. These weren't just paperwork changes, they were acknowledgments of a grim arithmetic. 2 sedatives, 1 respiratory center. Practice, as usual, lagged policy. Doctors who had long written both drugs found themselves holding competing pressures in the same visit. Policy warning on one side, a person in misery on the other. Chronic insomnia, flashbacks, restless nights. Prescription drug monitoring programs, rolled out or strengthened across US states and in parts of Canada and Australia, made overlapping prescriptions more visible. But visibility didn't erase demand. In some clinics, tighter control over prescribed opioids simply pushed people into street markets where the risks were more chaotic and, increasingly, more lethal. When a patient could no longer get a hydrocodone or oxycodone script filled, the low-cost and violent potency of illicit fentanyl became more attractive. And when the street supply included benzodiazepines deliberately mixed into powders, pressed into counterfeit pills, or bought separately, the risk of respiratory failure jumped again. The modern illicit supply added another twist. Contamination and mislabeling became routine. For many users, Xanax no longer meant pharmacy-grade alprazolam. It meant whatever the pill press operator had on hand. Behind that shift was a globalized, fast-moving chemistry. Starting around 2010, labs in parts of Asia, especially China's sprawling industrial chemical belt, but also some in India, began synthesizing powders of benzodiazepine analogues that had never been widely marketed as medicines. These designer benzos were engineered to be similar enough to produce a sedative effect, but different enough to sit outside existing legal schedules. Those powders traveled along global logistics routes into Mexico, Europe, and North America. There they were pressed into tablets mimicking well-known brands, Xanax bars, Valium-like rounds, or sold as powders and liquids. Darknet markets like Silk Road, Alphabay, and their descendants became glossy, if hidden, storefronts. Product photos, user reviews, escrow services, Bitcoin payments, encrypted messaging for customer service. The supply chain that used to run from factory to wholesaler to pharmacy now stretched from clandestine synth labs to freelance pill press operators to telegram channels and street dealers. Chemists in Guangdong, tablet presses in Sinaloa, resellers in Rotterdam, car trunks in Ohio. Law enforcement tried to chase this with international operations, seizures, and ever-expanding lists of scheduled substances. But the game was asymmetric. Legislatures and regulators moved in months or years. Underground chemists shifted a molecule in weeks, birthing a new analog that sidestepped a specific statute. The public health impact was twofold. First, benzos became more widely available outside of any medical supervision, so people using opioids had easier access to sedatives that deepened respiratory risk. Second, the unpredictability of street benzos turned dose calculation into guesswork. A tablet stamped to look like 2 milligrams of alprazolam might actually contain a potent designer compound, like flubromazolam at several times the effective strength, or be laced with fentanyl. Toxicology labs struggled to keep up. Many standard screens weren't set up to detect newer analogs. Even when benzos were found, they were sometimes reported generically. Some were missed entirely. Underdetection blurred the picture for epidemiologists trying to trace patterns, and for coroners trying to explain deaths. Flumazenil, the benzodiazepine antagonist, existed as a tool, but it was and remains a narrow-use instrument. In a chronic benzo user, it can trigger severe withdrawal and seizures. In mixed overdoses with tricyclics or other risky drugs, it can make things worse. It's not something you hand out in street-level harm reduction kits. On the ground, the pattern was grimly consistent. In cities like Philadelphia, Vancouver, Glasgow, in regional centres across New South Wales and British Columbia, coroners and ER staffs began encountering more cases where fentanyl and one or more benzos showed up together. Diazepam from an old script, plus etizolum from a pill bought online. Alprazolam plus fluelprazolam from a counterfeit bar. In Scotland, the appearance of etizolum, originally a Japanese-market thienodiazepine in street drugs, led to reports of zombie-like intoxications and long, complicated hospital stays. European and UN drug monitoring agencies issued repeated alerts. The list of newly detected designer benzodiazepines grew year by year. Each new entry meant a wave of users and responders would be flying partly blind until tests were developed and distributed. So benzodiazepines, once primarily a story about chronic dependence and domestic sedation, also became a frontline player in the acute overdose crisis, the quiet amplifier in a fatal mix. Zoom out from overdose wards to a quieter but equally consequential scene: older adults in their homes, nursing facilities, and hospital beds. Here, the benzodiazepine story seems less sensational but more insidious. It's about the long tail of post-war prescribing habits intersecting with aging bodies. By the late 20th century, people over 65 were, in many wealthy countries, the heaviest chronic users of benzodiazepines. The reasons were layered. Anxiety disorders, insomnia, grief, and chronic medical conditions were more common with age. Many had been started on benzos years or decades earlier, when guidelines were looser and warnings softer. For countless older adults, a morning or bedtime pill had become as normal as toast and coffee. The immediate relief was real. The cumulative costs came later. Short-term benzo use is known to impair psychomotor function and memory. In younger people, that might mean grogginess and slowed reaction time. In older adults whose livers and kidneys clear drugs more slowly, whose balance and reflexes are already fragile, that impairment translated into falls. A fall is not a minor mishap at that age. It's often a life-bending event. A fractured hip, emergency surgery, weeks of rehab, and a significant chance of sliding into permanent loss of independence or even early death. Studies from Europe, North America, and Australia stacked up, showing benzodiazepine use associated with increased risks of falls and fractures. Those fractures rippled through health systems, or time, rehab beds, home health hours, long-term care placements. The cognitive story was more contested. It's clear that benzos can cloud memory and cognition in the short and medium term. The bigger question, do they contribute to dementia, is harder. From the 2000s onward, several long-term observational studies suggested that extended benzodiazepine exposure correlated with higher dementia rates. But critics noted a major confounder: insomnia and anxiety are sometimes early symptoms of neurodegeneration. Were the drugs causing the decline or simply marking people who were already on that trajectory? Meta-analyses bounced between cautious concern and calls for more nuance. Geriatric and professional societies took the pragmatic route. Regardless of the dementia debate, the fall risk, delirium, and cognitive blunting were reason enough to avoid benzos in older adults whenever possible. This caution filtered into formal documents. In the US, the American Geriatric Society's Beers criteria began listing benzodiazepines as potentially inappropriate for older adults, highlighting increased sensitivity, slower metabolism, and the concrete risks. Cognitive impairment, delirium, falls, fractures. NICE in the UK and Choosing Wisely initiatives in Canada and elsewhere issued similar warnings. Keep benzo use in older people as short and rare as possible, especially for insomnia and routine agitation. On paper, the message was clear. In practice, change was halting. Deprescribing actually getting an 80-year-old who has taken temazepam every night for 20 years to taper off safely is slow relational work. It requires frequent visits, patient education, psychological support, coordination with families, and often non-drug replacements like CBTI. Many primary care systems simply aren't built for that. 10-minute visits, overfull panels, limited or no coverage for therapy, long wait lists for specialists, and there's fear on both sides. Patients fear months of sleeplessness and rebound anxiety. Clinicians fear seizures, hospitalizations, or destabilizing someone with fragile health and limited social support. In the context of polypharmacy, everything gets trickier. Benzodiazepines stacked alongside antidepressants, antipsychotics, antihypertensives, opioids. Pull one pillar and the whole structure might wobble. Evidence shows that structured deprescribing programs can work. Canadian trials like Empower used patient education leaflets and pharmacist outreach to help older adults reduce or stop benzodiazepines. Other interventions paired gradual dose reductions with CBTI or anxiety management. Success stories came out of academic centres in Toronto, the UK, Australia, but scaling these successes nationwide has proven hard. Health system incentives often don't reward the slower, counselling-heavy visits needed. Pharmacists are underutilised. Psychotherapy slots are scarce. In some places, benzodiazepine scripts have actually been swapped for other risky meds like pregabalin or gabapentin, which later turned out to carry their own misuse and overdose risks, prompting reclassification and new warnings. Ethically, clinicians are often stuck in grey zones. An 82-year-old who sleeps tolerably, hasn't fallen, and is terrified of change might be more harmed by an aggressive taper than by maintaining a low dose. Another older adult, already unsteady and suffering from memory problems, might benefit greatly from getting off. Each decision has to take into account medical risk, personal values, family support, and system capacity. Cookie-cutter rules fall apart quickly at the bedside. While health systems wrestled with deprescribing, the illicit benzo market kept mutating. From roughly 2010 onward, we saw an explosion of designer benzodiazepines, modified versions of the core scaffold that clandestine chemists nudged just enough to skirt existing regulations while preserving sedative power. Etizolum A thienodiazepine, developed and prescribed in Japan and a few other countries, became a street drug in parts of Europe and North America. Flubromazolam, clonazepam, flualprazolam, and other tongue-twisting compounds appeared in darknet catalogs. Many of them were more potent, longer-acting, or less predictable than the pharmaceuticals they mimicked. The global infrastructure made this possible. Chemical manufacturers selling semi-legitimate research compounds, online marketplaces with ratings and feedback, postal systems moving small envelopes across borders that customs could sample only in tiny fractions. Operation Pangea and similar multinational enforcement sweeps seized some shipments and shuttered some websites, but the overall flow kept moving, simply rerouted around blockages. Forensic and clinical toxicology lagged. Each new compound required new reference standards and validated assays before it could be reliably identified in blood or urine. By the time a lab could test for flubromazolam, the market might have shifted to clonazepam or something even newer. As a result, overdose surveillance was always a step behind reality. Law enforcement-only responses, as history has repeatedly shown with other drugs, risked backfiring. Every time authorities cracked down hard on one route, markets adapted, often in ways that made the supply more dangerous, not less. When local prescription benzos became harder to obtain, people turned to clandestine pills with unknown potency and contaminants. When a dominant darknet market was taken down, dozens of smaller, less scrupulous vendors popped up. Public health workers pushed a different mix: stronger toxicology and early warning systems, drug checking services, education about contamination risks, and wide naloxone distribution. That last tool, crucial as it is, doesn't touch benzodiazepines, but it still saves lives when opioids are in the mix. Stepping back, the Forbidden Dispensary sees three entwined benzodiazepine problems: their lethal synergy with opioids, their outsized risks in older adults, and their shape shifting into designer variants inflating overdose danger. All three trace, in some way, to a basic fact. A tool designed for short-term, supervised use was allowed to sprawl across chronic care, street economies, and aging populations without the right safeguards. The path forward has to be just as multidimensional as the mess we've made. Clinicians need to avoid opioid-benzo combinations whenever possible, use prescription monitoring tools as clinical aids rather than blunt weapons, and speak plainly with patients about interaction risks. Public health systems have to fund modern toxicology so we can actually see new benzos as they appear and tailor responses. For older adults, there must be time and resources to taper slowly, offer evidence-based psychological treatments, and support families during rough patches. On the supply side, international cooperation to disrupt truly dangerous manufacturing and trafficking needs to be paired with harm reduction, not pitted against it. Pill-checking sites, naloxone in every community, low-threshold addiction treatment. These are as necessary as customs officers and new schedules. Restriction without support only pushes people into darker corners of the market. History reminds the Forbidden Dispensary that there are no easy reversals here. The same properties that made benzodiazepines compassionate inventions, fast anxiolysis, strong sedation, are the ones that make them addictive, abusable, and deadly in combination. The challenge now is as logistical as it is ethical, to design systems that can pivot from reflexive prescribing to prevention, from impersonal interdiction to real-time surveillance, from ad hoc tapering to structured, humane deprescribing in older adults. Somewhere in that careful policy space lie the best chances we have for untying this knot, for separating medical kindness from unintended legacy harm. Voices started to collect in small, overlooked spaces, in church basements and community centers, in smoke-stained benches outside clinics, and later in the anonymous glow of early internet forums. They sounded nothing like the breezy press releases that had once promised calm. They were thin, stubborn, insistent. Stories pinned to the same odd stretch of time. Years, sometimes decades, lived with a little pill on the nightstand, meant to steady sleep or nerves, and then, suddenly or slowly, a life that no longer fit the brochure. In Britain and Australia in the 1980s, in Canada and the US in the 1990s, scattered self-help groups formed. With the web, they became an almost global chorus that couldn't be waved away. People wrote long, careful posts about trembling hands and high-pitched ringing in their ears, about a light sensitivity so vicious that supermarket aisles felt like interrogation rooms, about the holes in memory where a child's birthday or a friend's name evaporated mid-sentence. Some described symptoms clearing in weeks. Others chronicled a long winter of months or years, haunted by clinicians who either wrote another script or implied it was all psychological. At the center of many of those accounts sat a document part clinical manual, part talisman, that carried both hard pharmacology and a quiet, stubborn empathy. The work of Professor Heather Ashton of Newcastle. Her handbook, circulated first as photocopies in the 1980s, and then in a more polished form as the Ashton Manual in the 1990s, became a blueprint for patients and for a subset of clinicians willing to listen. Ashton, a pharmacologist and clinician, watched her lists fill with patients who couldn't sleep and could not be explained away by the usual psychiatric categories. She listened to letter after letter from people whose doctors had little to offer, beyond denial or more drugs. Her manual did two essential things. It recognized patterns that the mainstream literature had minimized or fragmented, and it sketched an escape route, cross-titration to a long-acting benzodiazepine if needed, then a slow, individualized taper over months, sometimes longer. The tables in her manual dose equivalents and incremental reductions became maps in an otherwise uncharted territory. The insistence on slow change, on adjusting to symptoms rather than arbitrary calendars, gave people a way to imagine withdrawal as a process that could be survived rather than a personal failure. Advocacy took root first where people were already trapped in waiting rooms, in wards, in online message boards, but it also crept into civic venues. Town hall meetings, parliamentary committee rooms, regulatory inboxes. Letters stacked up at agencies like the UK's Medicines and Healthcare Products, Regulatory Agency, the US FDA, and provincial bodies in Canada. They described not only physical misery, but the social wreckage, jobs abandoned, marriages unraveling, children estranged. A prolonged experience of being dismissed as malingerers or anxious types, when in truth they were navigating neuroadaptation and withdrawal. Out of those testimonies grew two linked claims that undercut the old pharmaceutical story. First, dependence and withdrawal could persist long after the last pill. Second, the experience could be profound, disabling, and life-changing. Not a mild passing flu, but a storm. There was pushback. Many clinicians, trained in a diagnostic culture that foregrounded primary mental disorders and downplayed iatrogenic harm, struggled to accept that a treatment they had prescribed could be the main driver of such enduring problems. Some worried that patient-led tapering communities might push overly rigid or idiosyncratic strategies that could worsen outcomes. Others feared that naming protracted withdrawal too broadly might blur the line between relapse of the original condition and drug-related symptoms. That tension ran hot. Patients accused doctors of gaslighting and neglect. Doctors accused activists of simplifying complex stories and reinforcing hypervigilance around bodily sensations. Behind the rhetoric was something more basic. Both groups were clinging to truths they felt they'd earned, the clinician's training and the patient's lived reality. Tapering itself became a contested field. Ashton's template switch to a long-acting benzodiazepine and reduce in measured steps was embraced by many as humane and realistic. Specialist clinics at university centres in Newcastle, London, Sydney, Toronto, and elsewhere built services around similar principles, adding sleep programs, psychological support, and close follow-up. But implementation across everyday practice varied wildly. Some clinicians favoured faster tapers, worrying about prolonging dependence indefinitely. Others championed micro-tapers, shaving off minute amounts over months on the theory that the nervous system needed long stretches to recalibrate. These weren't just academic debates. A rapid taper might tidy up a clinic's caseload, but leave a wake of relapse or ER visits. A very slow taper demanded appointments, counseling time, pharmacy adjustments, resources in short supply. Patients arrived at appointments equipped with spreadsheets, forum printouts, and highlighted copies of the Ashton Manual ready to negotiate. Many discovered that the health systems they relied on were not designed to honor the kind of time their bodies seemed to need. Advocacy solidified into campaigns. Groups lobbied regulators to strengthen warnings, fund research into long-term withdrawal, and ensure that prescribers provided real informed consent about dependence risks. They submitted case series, personal diaries, and documentation of withdrawal syndromes that persisted far beyond the tidy timelines in product inserts. Some pushed for specialized benzodiazepine withdrawal clinics and for national helplines. These efforts did shift the rhetoric. Language in drug monographs edged from rare dependence to more forthright acknowledgements that tolerance and withdrawal were common with long-term use and that courses should be short. National guidelines began to caution explicitly against long-term benzodiazepines for insomnia or nervousness. Yet even as words changed, practice lagged. Ashton's detailed protocols were embraced in some corners and ignored in others. Doctors complained they were impractical, equivalence tables were imprecise, pharmacies lacked the exact tablet strengths needed for tiny reductions. Electronic prescribing platforms balked at non-standard dose schedules. Systemic constraints did the rest. Short appointment slots, productivity metrics, reimbursement structures that paid better for quick scripts than for slow counseling. Many patients ended up running their own tapers, cutting pills, hoarding tablets to create finer steps, hunting down compounding pharmacists willing to make custom doses. Informal networks sprang up to fill the gaps. Lists of sympathetic clinicians, equivalence charts, how-to guides for negotiating with a skeptical GP. Anywhere the formal system failed, patient communities improvised. They taught moderators how to screen for serious red flags, indicating that someone needed emergency care. They built libraries of member-tested taper plans. They translated pharmacology into accessible language, becoming fluent enough to argue dosages and half-lives in consultations. Their successes were uneven but tangible. In several European countries, medical societies wrote stronger limits on benzodiazepine duration into official guidance. Hypnotics were framed as last-line, short-course tools. Anxiety guidelines leaned more on SSRIs, SNRIs, and CBT. The UK's NICE and similar bodies abroad championed CBTY as a first-line treatment for insomnia. Training curricula began to mention dependence and withdrawal more prominently. But policy, as always, came with paradoxes. When regulators tightened screws restricting reimbursements, capping durations, or pressuring prescribers through audits, some doctors simply dropped long-term patients cold rather than engage in painstaking tapering. In parts of Canada and Australia, people reported suddenly being cut off after years of use, with little or no transition support. Some turned to alcohol, others to street benzos or opioids. A measure designed to reduce harm sometimes generated new harms. So advocates argued not just for restrictions, but for capacity. Funded tapering programs, training for primary care clinicians in slow taper techniques, and integrated access to psychological support. They wanted systems that could say, no more indefinite refills, and also say, here's how we're going to help you off them safely. Who should steer tapering GPs or specialists remained a live question. In many cases, the ideal model seemed obvious. A GP who knew the patient well, backed up by specialist input when complications arose, and supported by community-based therapy services. In reality, tertiary clinics ended up with the most complex cases, while GPs under time and resource pressure managed everything else. Geography often decided fate. Someone living near a university city might find a specialized service. Someone in a rural area might be left with little but an overworked doctor and an internet printout. While this benzodiazepine-specific activism gathered momentum, a parallel policy machine spun up to address prescription drug misuse more broadly, particularly opioids. Benzodiazepines were pulled into this through the back door. Prescription drug monitoring programs, state systems in the US, provincial in Canada, real-time monitoring in Australia were expanded or built from scratch. These databases logged controlled substance dispensations and increasingly required clinicians to check them before prescribing. New York's I-Stop law in 2013 was one prominent early mandate, and other states followed. Ontario's narcotics monitoring system, Victoria's SafeScript, and similar infrastructures elsewhere aim to spot doctor shopping, risky combinations, and high-volume prescribers. Some European countries used more centralized oversight and tighter refill rules rather than US-style PDMPs. But the core idea was similar: electronic eyes on controlled scripts. When these tools were paired with educational outreach and real treatment options, they did some good. Clinicians got alerts when a patient was receiving multiple benzodiazepines or opioids from different prescribers. Letters went to doctors with atypically high prescribing patterns, sometimes accompanied by offers of training or consultation. Some people were referred into tapering or addiction treatment rather than just cut off. But surveillance systems are double-edged. When they're used to shame or punish prescribers without offering support, or to abruptly close a patient's access without a transition plan, they can push people toward the illicit market. PDMPs are also blunt instruments. They're excellent at counting pills, terrible at capturing context. A database can't show the story behind a 10-year script. The failed tapers, the lack of therapy access, the caregiver burdens at home. Cross-border enforcement layered on top of this. As domestic prescribing tightened, more people turned to overseas pharmacies operating in legal grey zones and to online sellers. Agencies like Interpol launched operations like Pangea to crack down on rogue internet pharmacies. US and European customs ramped up parcel inspections. Some networks were dismantled, others adjusted routes, suppliers, brand names. Every enforcement success created new gaps in which more toxic products could thrive. Attempts to restrict one medication often led to substitutions. In the UK and elsewhere, as benzodiazepine scripts dipped, gabapentinoid scripts, gabapentin and pregabalin rose sharply. These were marketed as safer alternatives for chronic pain, anxiety, and insomnia. Later, evidence of misuse and overdose risk, especially with opioids, forced regulators to reclassify them as controlled drugs. Harm had simply migrated into another chemical family. Taken together, the benzodiazepine saga becomes a case study in unintended consequences. A sedative hailed as a humane alternative to barbiturates turned in chronic use into a dependency problem. Warnings and restrictions meant to mitigate that risk sometimes left long-term users stranded or drove them toward unsafe substitutes. Crackdowns on legal supply, unaccompanied by support, enriched illicit markets peddling more dangerous analogues. For the Forbidden Dispensary, a few lessons stand out. First, the comforting simplicity of early risk-benefit claims is almost always an illusion. Short, tightly controlled trials can't predict what happens when a drug is woven into millions of ordinary lives, especially for unapproved durations and unwritten indications. Marketing that paints a pill as safe for everyday distress rewrites not just prescribing patterns, but cultural expectations about what kinds of emotion should be medicated. Second, voice matters. Without patient stories, angry, detailed, persistent, the full shape of benzodiazepine withdrawal and dependence would have taken much longer to register. That doesn't mean anecdotes should replace formal trials. But it does mean regulatory and professional systems have to build in ways to take lived experience seriously and to turn it into hypotheses worth testing. The Ashton Manual is a striking example of a bridge. Clinical expertise refined by listening to people over time. Third, policy that focuses only on cutting supply and tightening control without building the supports needed for safer change is ethically shaky and often counterproductive. Surveillance and restriction need to be yoked to funded, accessible tapering services, to training for frontline clinicians, to coverage for CBTI, anxiety therapies, and trauma work, and to a social safety net that reduces the pressures pushing people toward pills as first resort. Looking ahead, the research agenda runs on two rails: clinical and structural. Clinically, we still need solid comparative data on tapering strategies. Slow versus fast is only the beginning. We need trials that look at micro-tapers, at step-down versus intermittent reductions, at different substitution strategies, and at combinations of pharmacologic and non-pharmacologic supports. There's early work exploring low-dose flumazenil and other agents to potentially reset benzodiazepine-modified receptors. Small series and pilot studies hint at benefits, but they're not enough yet to reshape standard care. We also need long-term follow-up on people who successfully stop tracking cognition, function, and quality of life, to understand who recovers fully, who struggles for years, and why. Structurally, comparative policy work is vital. Which bundles of interventions, PDMPs plus specialty clinics, audit and feedback plus CBTI access, deprescribing incentives plus harm reduction services, produce the best net outcomes in different systems. Sweden, with a strong social medicine tradition, will not mirror the US, with its fragmented, insurance-driven care. We need international studies that incorporate not just prescriptions and overdose counts, but patient-reported experiences. Harm reduction has to be baked into benzodiazepine policy just as it is for opioids. That means recognizing that for some individuals, especially older adults, or people with severe refractory conditions, continuing a reduced, stable benzodiazepine dose may be the least bad option. For others, a carefully supported taper is right. One-size-fits-all rules risk pushing vulnerable people into worse danger. Alternatives must also be real, not theoretical. CBTI has strong evidence. Access to it is patchy. SSRIs, SNRIs, buspirona, and other non-benzodiazepine medications can help in anxiety disorders, but they bring their own withdrawal and side effect debates. Scaling psychological therapies, integrating them into primary care, and making them financially accessible are not luxuries. They're prerequisites for any honest attempt to reduce benzodiazepine dependence. On the industry side, the benzodiazepine era is a cautionary tale. Early marketing normalized chronic use. Today, the techniques are subtler but similar. Sponsored CME, guideline committees with industry ties, manufactured thought leaders. Transparency about conflicts, independent trial funding, and regulatory vigilance are necessary if we want evidence synthesized around public health, not sales targets. Practically, governments that helped create this landscape by approving, reimbursing, and for years encouraging benzodiazepine prescribing, now have an obligation to fund the unwinding, specialist services, training, research, and patient support. Internationally, law enforcement will continue to chase illicit labs and online vendors. But if those efforts aren't coordinated with public health strategies that keep legitimate, supervised care accessible, we'll repeat the familiar pattern. Squeeze the legal market, swell the clandestine one. Finally, the Forbidden Dispensary wants to end where the patient stories began, with people learning, often painfully, to convert private suffering into collective pressure and change. What has moved regulators and professional bodies isn't just charts and p-values. It's the cumulative weight of letters, testimonies, and organized advocacy pointing to the gap between what labels promised and what bodies endured. If benzodiazepines are a parable about the perils of quick pharmaceutical fixes, they're also proof of what can happen when medicine listens. Not instantly, not perfectly, but eventually slowly integrating lived experience, updating warnings, adjusting guidelines, and funding new approaches. There won't be a single clean ending. New tranquilizers will arrive, new withdrawal syndromes will be named. Old debates will reappear in altered form, but a different script is being written, one that takes seriously the nervous system's slow timelines, centers informed consent, and treats support for withdrawal not as a favor, but as a core medical responsibility. The work will be incremental, a taper, not a cut-off. It will require humility from clinicians, resources from governments, rigor from researchers, and continued organizing from patients who refuse to let their stories be footnotes. That is the uneasy comfort the Forbidden Dispensary leaves you with. No miracle, no villain-free narrative, just the possibility of doing better, more slowly, more honestly, and with a deeper respect for the fragile terrain we cross every time we put a small, powerful tablet into someone's hand.